Welcome, everyone. Today is one of our fundamental question series events where we have a fun, casual conversation built around one of the fundamental questions of biotech. And today, our question is, how will clinical trials leverage telemedicine? We have some excellent guests who have deep knowledge within this space. My name is Julie Wolf. I am part of the IndieBio team here in New York, and I would like to now turn over the introductions to first introduce Joel Morse, CEO and founder of Curavit Clinical Trials. Thank you, Joel, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And co-founder, I have several other co-founders at Curavit, and they're hopefully on the call today. What Curavit does is provides designs and executes decentralized or what are more commonly referred to as virtual clinical trials. And with virtual clinical trials, the patient is in their home. And obviously, telemedicine is a key component of that. So thank you for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Joel. And also joining us today is Carl Schmieder, CEO and founder of Messaging Lab. Thank you for joining us today, Carl.
Thanks, Julie, for inviting me, and thanks, Joel, for joining us as well. So Messaging Lab is a strategy and communications firm that's been around for almost 20 years. And clinical trials companies, so CROs, digital clinical trials companies, as well as biotech companies have always been a part of our client base. So I've spent a lot of time doing strategy for CROs and helping them, get themselves together for marketing to biotech companies or emerging biotech companies in particular, which is kind of where I've always been interested. And most recently worked with a digital virtual trials company called Transparency Life Sciences on their communications strategy. So I've got a fair amount of familiarity when it comes to what the impact of telemedicine and digital trials are on trials. And I think it's actually very exciting because in many ways, the way trials have been conducted, and I'm not the first one to say this, it's a little bit of a broken system. Most people don't even know that, you have the opportunity to be in a trial, and sometimes if you're in a trial, you get the best standard of care. And making them digital and leveraging these new technologies, I think really opens it up to a broader audience and means that it's going to be much more accessible, especially with the way technology is evolving. And I'm looking forward for us to kind of talk about the impact of technology on this as well.
Excellent, excellent. So I would like you to maybe, I was going to just say hi and then say, would you mind talking a little bit about what you guys do in the clinical trial or telemedicine space? You've already covered that. So excellent, we're already ahead of the game. So I do want to talk about where we are with clinical trials and what the future looks like, but I do think that it's important for us to understand where we are. And actually, I'm going to pause right now because I see Letizia Gianfrida, our third panelist, has fixed her connectivity issues and her subway has arrived a little bit late.
Hello, Letizia. Everyone. Apologies for being late. Hello.
No worries. We're actually just getting started.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Letizia, co-founder of and CEO of Isarthronica, can you please introduce yourself and your role within the company and what Isarthronica does, just very briefly in like 2 or 3 minutes?
Of course. So my background is as a bioengineer. I did my PhD at Imperial College London, and as part of my PhD, I then spin out a company named Isarthronica. The aim of Isarthronica is to provide remote consultations and remote assessment for rheumatic conditions, and in particular for immune-mediated inflammatory disorders. And with respect to clinical trials in particular, we have been involved in a number of different clinical trials, starting with Leeds NHS Trust here in the UK, as well as at Imperial, and most recently at King's NHS Trust. But my experience with clinical trials is also outside from kind of like the space of Isarthronica itself. I studied at the New York University, NYU Langone Medical Center, and during my studies, I got involved in a number of different projects and clinical trials. After that, I also worked as a software engineer in Singapore for a medical project that also involved the use of artificial intelligence and for medical imaging. And yeah, so that's pretty much who I am and what the company does.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think that many of our audience are probably a little more familiar with clinical trials, given that clinical trials are in the news all the time in terms of the COVID vaccine, at least understanding that there are different phases and these things test both safety and efficacy. The two major things that a clinical trial needs to demonstrate is that a new modality of some sort is both effective, of course, that it works to change the course of some sort of treatment for a disease or some sort of human health ailment, and that it's safe, that there are no side effects, that there are not populations who might have deleterious effects, that there's a broad enough testing of people with different backgrounds to ensure that it could positively impact everyone who would be given this modality once it is approved. And so in order to run all of these different types of trials, conventionally, we have needed these three different items. And so I really like this panel because we're talking about experts who have expertise in disrupting all three of them. And those are a research university, an actual physical location where people will go in order to, have their assessments done. The knowledge, the assessment, and that could be a healthcare provider who is measuring some sort of outcome. And I think that this is where, telemedicine really starts to come into play. And of course, participants. How do you get people to, know that there is a clinical trial? How do you enroll a large enough number that the statistical power is going to be able to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of whatever it is that you're testing? So I thought we could kind of hit these one at a time with the different, maybe working backwards, starting with how do we get people to know that there is a clinical trial at all these different various phases. So I'm actually going to turn first to you, Carl, and ask how, as someone who works a lot in messaging and helping with communication strategies, how do we get people to even know that this is something that they can participate in? And then we'll work our way backwards from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting what you said, Julie, in terms of like right now, the state that we're in with the coronavirus, pandemic, and everybody kind of is, a amateur biologist, and the development of the vaccines and therapies for COVID-19 are front page, top of your feed or whatever every single day. And so I think there is this increased awareness that there is a process to develop drugs or vaccines, but I think that awareness is still kind of on a surface level. I mean, I think that, for many of the companies that are developing these vaccines or these drugs, you hear the news that people are being recruited and that the trial is ongoing, but you don't really see how are they recruiting people. And so I'm actually really glad that Letitia's on, because she's going to, I'm hoping she talks a little bit about, use of AI for this. But traditionally, I would say that it had been that, there was like a PR component, a marketing component that would happen. And then you had a university or universities that were participating in the trial that would be looking for patients. But I think we've moved into a place where you can really use social media to target people much more accurately. And in addition, you can leverage things like patient groups or patient associations, disease associations, to also get directly in front of the patients that you would want to be in your trial. And I think with the use of AI, you can be even more targeted. And so then in a way, it kind of becomes like a social media campaign, just targeted to a very specific audience. And I think we've started to see more of that happen increasingly. And I think that, especially now that we're moving into this world where so much is done digitally, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And I'm hoping that we see a lot more awareness of, what a trial is and why someone might want to participate. And I'd really love to hear Letitia and Joel, talk about that as well.
Yeah, so Joel or Leticia, I'd be happy to hear your insights into how to enroll patients. How do we let people know that there is something that they can participate in?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next.
Yeah, please.
So in terms of like what you said and about so starting with the number of patients, really, I think is very important to kind of like, so taking a step back, right? So taking a step back into the actual, when we kind of like mention clinical trials, we sometimes like mention clinical trials that are for a specific chemical compound or for a diagnostic digital health therapeutic solution, or which are very different, in fact. And the way in which the study is structured is very different as well. Because in the latter, so in the case of a digital health solution, we can actually have virtual clinical trials sometimes. There are also remote and can allow, decentralized trials in multiple locations, while for chemical compounds, really the actual trials tend to be in one specific location. So I think the first point is usually to start with some sort of like structured power calculation that is done on behalf of the research team, the clinical collaborators, to really understand the amount of patients that you need into the clinical trial, as well as how to engage with those patients, to put in, together ethics approval and the protocol that you will possibly adopt into the clinical trial, and then to start the actual phases of the clinical trial and the actual stages itself. So it's very interesting how also this COVID-19 pandemic has, advanced and really has been able to really power up the virtual clinical trials and telemedicine approach, as well as, of course, as we have all seen the approach and the use of digital health for remote and decentralized trials that we have seen most recently.
I hear these terms used, and I hear them used interchangeably, and maybe we could even have a very quick aside about the terms that we're using in terms of telemedicine, telehealth, digital health. How do you guys, who are experts in the field, use these? Are they all synonyms for one another, or do you use some in specific circumstances, such as when an assessment is being made, or some sort of patient metric?
Yeah, I can start, and sometimes I think we all get a little bit sloppy in terms of the terminology, whether it be telemedicine or telehealth. I think they are defined terms. And so when you're providing telemedicine, you are actually providing a medical assessment over a Zoom or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that falls under the regulations of how medicine is provided. So that would be, for example, if you are a patient in that receiving care, you are getting that care from somebody who is licensed in your state, as an example. And that's, I think that as we've seen this pandemic, I think regulatory has been out in front helping in lessening some of those regulations that can be managed effectively while keeping patient safety at the forefront. So I think that if I probably use them interchangeably too much myself, but telemedicine I think is a specific defined term. Telehealth is more broadly, I think, a generic term in terms of it could be a doctor, it could be someone else, an investigator engaging with you, even maybe across state lines and having that appropriate. Digital health, I think this is a really broad term that is used to encompass everything as it relates to wearables. They have patient-generated health data. They have, you hear terms direct data capture. You hear terms, PRO, patient-recorded outcome. I think all of these, devices and stuff that are out there, I think that generally falls under digital health. Carl?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that the two that might be confusing or new to people are also digital trial and virtual trial. And the way I would define those is digital trial is basically any trial that is using a digital tool, whereas a virtual trial is a trial that doesn't necessarily have a location specific. Because historically, as Letitia said, you would have university health centers or medical centers would be the place where a patient would go to participate in a trial. But when you do a virtual trial, you no longer need to do that. And I think a digital trial is also kind of a little bit more of a blanket term that encompasses whether it's a digital trial or not. And then you would use telemedicine as part of the trial as a way to interact with your patients.
Yeah. So as you guys said, I think like the telemedicine versus, well, telehealth is a broader kind of like scope of remote healthcare services, whereas telemedicine refers specifically to remote clinical services. Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those assessments and the ways that those can be made digitally. I know that Arthronica has some really amazing AI algorithms that have been built to assess accurately and relatively cheaply certain types of chronic diseases. Do you want to expand on that a little bit, Letizia?
Of course, yes. So yeah, so I'm gonna take a very brief step back. Starting with sort of like the work that I was doing in Singapore, I essentially was working there as a researcher to build an AI that was able to recognize patches on the skin and skin cancer, the size essentially of the tumor on the skin. Then when I started my PhD at Imperial College, the PhD was between essentially the use of computer vision and the application of computer vision, which is essentially teaching cameras how to see as humans do, but kind of like how to extract analytics from cameras. So it was between the combination of computer vision and biomechanics. So biomechanics is essentially like the field that bioengineering that studies essentially kinematics and kinetics, so motion and forces of the human limb. So but the way in which it was done at the time at Imperial, and my department at Imperial was actually like affiliated to the department at Stanford, so was actually like the state of the art kind of like technology, and it's currently as well is using this optoelectronic motion capture system. So it's a set of like different infrared cameras with one RGB camera and a lot of different markers that are applied on the patient's body. In this way, you can actually like capture all the different ligaments and tendons and forces and motions and all that, which is of course like very extremely important, but is also not really scalable. So what I have been what I was working on at the time was okay, so let's use RGB cameras, let's use standard cameras that are embedded in any device like laptops, smartphones and tablet and so forth to train a novel neural network that can essentially take the information from this optoelectronic motion capture system and then gather and output the same amount of information, but just essentially from one camera. So that's pretty much like the foundation of our AI. So now the aim of our AI, which is essentially just a number of like different layers of convolutional neural networks, is and the foundation of it is essentially the ability to measure swollen joint and the ability to measure disease activity scoring system in output for a specific immune-mediated inflammatory condition, as I was saying at the beginning. So while I started from, a very kind of like generic biomechanics approach, then as part of the design clinical trial, we decided to, focus and really tailor the AI around the use of train the AI around the data gathered from a patient with rheumatoid arthritis. Mm-hmm. And currently the platform is being used in different trusts and being tested in different trusts across the UK. And we are also approaching the US market as well. So yeah, that's where we are at with Arthronica and with our AI.
And your system, does it completely free the user from needing to go to the doctor? Is this something that the system, once the camera takes a picture, can it give you some sort of measurement, or is that relayed to a healthcare professional who would then say, okay, well, I agree with this, so let's send on,
so the way in which, so at the beginning, it was actually like relying on the rheumatologist, on the clinical specialist that was saying, okay, I agree with this interpretation of the picture, of the video, and then the analytics that the platform is providing in output. The way in which we then, the way in which we structured the very last study that we are about to start at King's College Hospital here in the UK is that the platform itself and the results from the platform will be performed and benchmarked against the data and output from, the disease activity score done from a face-to-face assessment with a rheumatologist. In this way, essentially, the platform has its own right of being a diagnostic tool. So in this way, essentially, like the patient doesn't need to go to the rheumatologist, the data will be, of course, shared with the clinical professional, with rheumatologists, that is able then to see all the longitudinal data and what is going on, what is happening. But the actual assessment itself, that was taking hours on behalf of the rheumatology nurse, the rheumatologist, to be done, now is fully performed by the isarthronica platform in 15 minutes versus more than 1 hour.
Yeah, and also you imagine patient travel time and
on top of that, of course, yes.
All of that time is being saved. Yeah, very interesting. And let's turn now to the distributed use of some of these. And I think, Joel, I know that you are working with healthcare providers in order to help find some of the patient populations that we were talking about at the beginning. But also there's a measure of telemedicine in your Curavit in terms of helping to, have the portal where people will interact with medical experts. So can you talk a little bit about how you can use that type of service?
Yeah, and what we like to do is work with current healthcare providers sometimes, because as you look for patients, and I think the social media has been outstanding in terms of helping. However, the fact is still, 70% plus people need their primary physician to kind of encourage them to join a trial. So that is part of it. And then, so how we engage with telemedicine, it really lines up with the trial protocol. So we're doing a COVID trial right now, as an example, not it's a trial where we're testing a new indication for people that are sick, but not sick enough to go in their hospital. It's not a vaccine. So, and what we're doing is having them being in the trial. So they're COVID positive in the trial for 14 days, and they're per protocol 2 telehealth sessions a day, so that they are on with a physician twice a day to monitor their vital signs. They fill out surveys about how they feel. They take their temperature, they take their O2, et cetera. So telemedicine is critical in this regard, because the patient wants to be in their home. They're not sick enough to be in the hospital. And we have an exciting new indication on a drug that can potentially significantly lessen the burden of COVID for these patients. And so it can only happen in the house, working with a physician who can engage, doesn't have to go in to see him, safely engage twice a day over telemedicine. So telemedicine has been pretty critical in this trial.
And how does the ability to, oh gosh, I hear a terrible, I hope you guys
didn't hear
that. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Joel, how does the ability to do that type of continuous monitoring twice a day change the ability to measure patients' progression during the clinical trial, rather than, let's say, having them come in once a week or every other week, the way that perhaps a more centralized trial might do?
Yeah, in this case, the protocol calls for three measurements per day. So 2 health measurements. So there's I think 13 data points on each one. So in the morning and between 6 and 9 in the morning, 6 and 9 at night, and then what they call an SF36 assessment, which basically measures 36 questions that measure how you feel and how you engage, walking and talking and things like that. And by having 2 telehealth sessions per day, it helps the patient stay on that regimen. So there's it's a pretty burdensome trial. You take your medicine every 4 hours, you have to fill out these surveys, you have to talk to the doctor. So, and you're sick, you have COVID, not a wonderful disease. And so it just helps the patient stay focused and stay in the trial. And that's been really important for this trial. And, I'd emphasize that probably no 2 trials are the same, so that you really want to develop a protocol that leverages digital technologies as appropriate and engages with a healthcare professional as appropriate. And the thing with telemedicine is it makes it a lot more flexible for the patient to be in their home, to do it at certain times that are more convenient for them, and to take away the commute and the hassle of getting into the clinic.
Yeah, I think it's, sorry, Julie, I was going to say that, I think it's worth saying that, this idea of moving into digital and, virtual trials is something that the FDA has encouraged. Like in the United States, the FDA has really been encouraging drug developers to look for ways to do more of these kinds of trials. And what I've understood is that part of the reason why trial recruitment is so low, yes, there's an awareness issue, but the other part of it is that many trials, and this might be heresy for the people who are designing the trials, but many trials are very poorly designed, and the people who are designing the trials don't take into consideration the fact that you're basically going to disrupt a participant's life by making them go into the doctor, go to some university and someplace that might not be in their town. And so when you move to this digital trial, virtual trial paradigm, what you're doing is you're opening it up, not just because you're giving people their time, but it also means that you also have to be, the developers have to be a little bit creative in terms of the way that they're going to design their trial in a way that makes it much more attractive to potential patients. Now, one of the things that I'd worked on was these trials where it's not just telemedicine, but you also have home health aides coming in. So if like a drug has to be administered, you can have a nurse come to the patient. That way the patient doesn't have to go to the university. Same thing with like if they have to have if they have to have vitals measured that are not things that can be done digitally. And I hope we can talk about that because I think wearables are really going to open this up. But like, let's say you have to take a blood sample or a urine sample or some kind of bodily fluid sample. Well, you don't have to go somewhere. They just send, a nurse or a home health aide to you. And this all becomes part of the protocol. And all that stuff, again, opens up the patient's time and makes it much more attractive to a patient to potentially participate in a trial. And that kind of stuff is very new. And like I said, the FDA is really encouraging drug developers to do more of this. And I apologize for interrupting you, Julie.
No, it was perfect. And you're exactly right. Tufts Center for Drug Development said, compared, I think the last 5 years to, 10 years ago, the burden of drug trials has gone up like 75%.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's exactly right, Carl.
Meaning that trials are more complicated than ever, requiring more patient involvement. Yeah. And, and so, that's part of the reason why they don't recruit enough people.
Yep. Right. Or people get recruited, then they fall out.
Yeah, and actually, that's actually a really huge problem because if someone gets recruited, they participate in a trial for a certain amount of time, a bunch of data is collected, but then they realize that the trial is going to be very onerous. That could be hundreds of thousands of dollars that the drug developer is losing because they no longer have that patient, and then they have to go and recruit another patient to replace the one that they've lost.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, if to sum up what you guys have said much more eloquently than what I'll say, but it's basically like, don't superimpose the technology onto something that exists, but build the design the trial using these digital technologies in ways that you can really get to the place that you want to go and makes it as user-friendly as one could make it.
Yeah, and I think that, of course, there's going to be indications like, if it's a cancer trial, and, that's going to be something where you want the patient to go to a certain place. And I think most people don't realize that if you go into a cancer trial, you're probably going to get the best care that you can probably get. Like I've done work on cancer in children, and it's just very clear that any kid that gets cancer is going into a trial, and every one of those trials is by far the best care that kid can get. But there's just so many other indications, like Letitia is talking about, rheumatoid, immune system related diseases. I worked on one where it was like multiple sclerosis, and the measures were like movement, how you can move. And so there was a lot of ways to measure that. And so, and I think some of the really early digital trials were things in dermatology where you're like taking pictures, again, kind of like what Letitia is talking about. And so these things have evolved over the last I would say 10 years, but I really believe it's just really been like the last 3 to 5 years that this stuff has really moved into a space where it makes sense. And I think, at some point we'll talk about the technology, and I think we should talk about how the trends in technology will impact this as well.
Yes, I definitely do want to talk about the different types of readings and metrics that you can get, and whether a smartphone is the best device to use because it's more convenient to patient populations. So maybe we could head in that direction right now. So, I mean, that is, in terms of making it something that is accessible to people, not having them have the burden of having to either purchase or even pick up or have delivered an extra piece, an extra device, is one that you can see as an advantage. But there are all types of devices right now that can do, various types of oxygen measurement or, temperature readings, et cetera. And some of these continuously, right? So it's not just that time-bound measurement. So I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of devices and where those are going, and whether our smartphones will turn into something that is, Apple Watch, smartphone, like heart rate. Well, it is a heart rate monitor already, but all of these additional health metrics as well.
Yeah, I'll start on that because I think that look, the devices, and Carl, you indicated that the device innovation is really going to drive a lot of this, and certainly the smartphone has been critical in that. But I'd suggest that there'll be other things. So as an example, we're starting to do some hearing trials. And really, if you want to have, high frequency hearing tests where the subject does not have to go into their local ENT and, be exposed in a very small room to COVID and things like that, you are going to need a very specialized, hearing device that, is not your earbuds into your smartphone and taking a test. So I still think that for a lot of advanced critical endpoints, you are going to need some very specific devices, and some of those devices might have to be shipped to the home and be used in the home, through the course of the trial. And I think the costs are coming down, and the importance of clinical trials and patient recruitment is so high that that business model does work. But I think the smartphone taking over everything is probably a little premature.
Yeah. What about things like, let me just follow on.
Yeah.
Bad sound. I'm so sorry, everyone. Just let me add a follow-on question before you answer, Carl, and I want to hear you as well, Leticia. What about biomarkers and things becoming a little bit more advanced like that, doing like minimal blood sampling, for example, at home? Do you see that in the, let's say, next 5 years?
It's not my area of expertise. I've read that, that will come, but, Theranos, I thought that was going to be the, right. So I'll hold off. It's not my area of expertise.
Yeah, and it's not mine either, but I would say that, I think the example that I gave earlier of if someone is going to be looking at biomarkers, you can have, the home health aide come to your house, draw your blood, take your samples. And so as those biomarkers become more prevalent or, become important in these trials, I think we'll see a lot more of that. Totally. I will say, we saw this, the latest iteration of the Apple Watch, now measures oxygen levels. So they keep improving and adding, additional features to the watch. And, I think if we look at the big 5 technology companies, is it the FANGs, is that what they're called? For them to grow, like by any significant means, they're going to go into healthcare. We've already seen Apple has a research kit that's attached to their watch, and there's trials that are conducted that way. Amazon did a joint venture with JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway to create kind of healthcare clinics. Walmart has healthcare clinics. So, for the big companies, Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft, for them to really see significant growth. And we're talking about companies that are, close to $1 trillion, Apple $2 trillion in market cap. They're going to start to go after markets that, are inefficient. And yes, there's a cost of entry, but it's a place where they can have an outsized impact and also see outsized, profits potentially.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Leticia, do you have thoughts on what types of devices outside of course?
Yeah. So I think just in terms of like digital health metrics that you were mentioning before, I think that in terms of like those metrics, it's also like Carl was saying, they can really advance the understanding of features of impairment body functions, for instance, like the neurological disorders that Carl was saying. But in terms of like digital biomarker, it's all about, it's a data-driven approach, right? So it's all down to the portables, wearable, implantable, digestible, kind of like sensor or solution that is taking the data from, where the data essentially are objectively collected and are quantifiable data. But I think like the actual approach in the long run will be an approach that can be that can work in parallel with kind of like standard procedures of care, and can perhaps even support to predict and modify treatment regimes. But I don't necessarily see, in terms of like chronic disorders in the long run, that they would entirely take over if we only speak about portables, wearables, and implantable or digestible digital biomarkers.
I see. Excellent. So we're coming up to the top of the hour, but we did start a little bit late. So I want to ask our panelists if you guys can stay on for another 10 minutes or so that we can continue the conversation.
Yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. And to those of you who are in the audience, if you can't finish with the conversation today, if you refresh the browser at any time, we will have this recording available for you to watch later on. We do have a question from the audience, and I think this is a very common question in terms of who is being recruited and whether these new types of technologies will be able to diversify the patient populations that are being recruited. And so the actual question here is, I wonder if there has been an increase in diversity in patient populations, but I think we could even speculate about how that might look going forward.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I think that it helps. There are underserved populations that, especially in rural areas, that, access is important. But I think that it is one component, but probably not even the most important. There was a New York Times article yesterday, and I think it was titled, I won't be used as a guinea pig for white people. And it was a beautifully written article that actually ended with hope, because what it was in the African-American community outside of Pittsburgh, they wanted to recruit and have enough African-American population for the COVID vaccine trial. And it was underrepresented. 3%, I believe, in the trial were African-American. And so at the end of the article, I believe that they talked that it maybe went up to 10 or 12 or something like that %, which is a better ratio. How did they get there? They didn't get there through the technology. They got there through building trust, and building trust through people that were working in the community. And I think that the FDA is really pushing this, and they even put out new guidance as late as, I think it was July of last year. And big pharmaceutical companies are taking stock. They are adding high-level executives that are focused on diversifying their clinical trials, but it is a much broader issue than just technology. It is building trust in the community, and that takes just a lot of work and a lot of time. Letitia?
Yes, that was a very, very interesting article. We could probably add a link to it, actually, so that folks can revisit. Leticia, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point as well, the one that you made. So I think I was pretty much like saying the same. So I think like the advance of these opportunities of digital enrollment can really encourage the enrollment, especially like in the younger population, but eventually it's down to a number of different factors to actually raise awareness of clinical trials opportunities.
I wonder if there's any double-edged sword in terms of access, right? So, for example, people who might not be on social media to see that this is an opportunity, if that becomes the way to recruit populations, right? Like, it's kind of less popular to be on Facebook nowadays for various reasons, right? So if someone runs a Facebook ad campaign, you might miss your key demographic of whoever it is that you're trying to recruit. Similarly, you could say that, smartphones are great and pretty ubiquitous, among many of the people the circles of the people who are probably on this call, but, that's still 80% of, people within the UK and the US that have a smartphone. So I wonder if we could talk about, just what access really looks like in terms of bringing in people by targeting so specifically, if we might become too narrow in the way that we are looking at who is going to be brought into these trials. Any thoughts around that?
I think that's a big issue. There's a study done in Louisiana last year as well, talked about the population there and how they find trials and how they would volunteer to be in a trial. And social media was way low on the list of what drove it. And what drove it was their physician or somebody, actually their minister or a priest. So I think that in order to really solve or start to solidly address the patient recruitment, we need to understand and understand why people would do it and who they trust. And a lot of times that's their primary physician. And so the education, I think a good part of that education can be focused on the primary care physician, who then can make that connection and learn more if there's a preliminary connection made between one of their patients that is experiencing some challenges and they're vaguely familiar with 100 trials. So.
Right. So the physician could become like the trusted source who knows of what is available, right? Is this something that when you speak to physicians, Joel, that you've seen like, oh, I wish I knew more about opportunities for my patients? I mean, I could see the benefit, of course, to, getting people from various geographies involved, right?
Yeah, no, every single doctor would say, because the doctors are in it for patient care. So every single doctor would say, I wish I knew more. 99% of those doctors will also say, I have no time to really understand and study clinical trials. So there's a big problem at the intersection of healthcare delivery and research. And I think that, there's a few ways to, address it, but it's a big challenge for the healthcare community, and it hasn't been helped by COVID because a lot of the primary care physicians and medical groups have struggled through COVID and are looking for new business models that will help them. And telemedicine is actually, I think, helped, but also it's going to have to change their business model. So unfortunately, I think I'm bringing up more problems than solutions. I do think the solution orbits around trusted healthcare providers, but just getting them to be able to figure out which trial for which patient is some work that needs to be done.
And I might even go one step further back and put the onus a little bit on the people who are designing the trial, because the trial designers are actually going to be looking for a very specific population. They're looking for a specific patient and they need a certain number of them. And so, I mean, I love the idea of, oh, well, we'll just jump to social media, but we know that recruiting that way is very low. And I think, Joel, to your point, you could have very good and very robust, recruiting if you're involving your primary care physician. So I think the trial designers really need to understand, where are they going to find these populations, and they need to, they should understand that that's the kind of the marketing campaign that they need to do to get the patients recruited. And I think a big part of that is, working with the primary care physicians, like Joel has said.
Absolutely. So I think we've talked about trust a little bit, and I started to think about trust and how you can, engender trust. And one of the things that patients may be worried about is how their data is going to be used, or how is it safe once you have that digital information out there? Could it be used for a second trial that they haven't consented to, et cetera? Now, I imagine that is not the case, but what is the education like in terms of getting someone to sign up to use Arthronica, or to educate them through the patient consent process with Curavit in order to, allay those fears and explain what the both the digital safety, but also just, the risk of being within a trial, which I think is something usually you sit down with your physician or with a person who's running the trial in order to really fully understand.
Yeah, so I think like it's all down, as you were saying, Julie, to like trust that you build with like patients, with the charity, with the clinicians that are actually recommending the adoptions of the platform. Of course, there is always like an issue of an underrepresented part of the population and how to raise awareness of the use of the platform elsewhere. But I think at least here in the UK, what we have done is collaborating quite extensively with the charities, a number of like different charities, including the National Rheumatoid Arthritis Society, the Arthritis that are doing just a great job in supporting patients around the country and around Europe actually. So collaborating with them, we have been able to, gain trust
Having someone in authority to really vouch for your
in authority, but also someone that wasn't only coming from the medical professional, but also from the clinician, the clinical team, but also from the helpline and the support that they usually get from the community as well.
So
I think the data privacy is always a big concern, but that is addressed very forthrightly with the informed consent, and I think that for the most part, we have seen once the subject has gone through the many stages that they feel confident that when they're signing that informed consent that you will treat their data well. I think one of the biggest challenges actually in the industry is getting the data back to the patient. How was the trial? How was, how did I fare in the trial, et cetera? And I think the industry has done not a great job getting patient data back to them and giving them reinforcement about, how did the trial go? What were the results? Things like that.
Making sure that people, have their own metrics that are being provided.
Close the loop. The loop rarely gets closed from a patient perspective, and I think that does need to change.
Yes, and I would imagine in some of the burdensome trials, it would be beneficial to patients, not only for their own edification, but to keep them along the line, participating throughout the entire length of the trial.
Right, and sometimes trials can go on for years, but that patient was only in there for 4 months. And then the trial goes on for 2 years. So they really can't get there's really no trial data for a couple more years. So, some of the physical or the structural elements of a trial make it more difficult and make it less timely, but I still think it's very important to get that data back to the patient.
Absolutely. So I phrased the question that I wanted to build this conversation around very specifically, because I think it is important that clinical trials leverage telemedicine and not just what is the future of these, because clinical trials are a thing that have existed for a long time, right? And so I'm going to ask each of you to kind of answer that question, which I know is a very broad question, but in a short, succinct way. Like if you could have a tweet-sized answer for how clinical trials could, leverage telemedicine to make the future of clinical trials more successful, to increase the safety and the efficacy of these different modalities that are being tested. What would you like people to take away from this conversation? And I know this is kind of a big question, and I didn't send it ahead of time, so it's going to be kind of top of your head. But I would really like to hear what you think is important for someone who is perhaps not as ensconced in this topic. What the takeaway is.
Perhaps just like simply, I don't know whether it is, it's just like on top of my mind. Of course, like everyone is talking about COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And I think like adopting decentralized trials now more than ever can be actually like seen as the future. And telemedicine is actually like, the tool that can allow that to keep participants safe and while, of course, if the study is structured and properly designed, still provide valuable research to continue moving forward.
Thank you, Leticia, for going first. I know that was kind of a big question to answer.
I would just comment that telemedicine enables you as a subject or a patient to build a meaningful relationship with a caregiver so that your health is in your health monitoring is improved. And I think that that's a really important aspect of telemedicine. Maybe what COVID gave us was that everybody is more comfortable with things like this, including an older population. So before, where they say, I can't have a relationship with my doctor on telemedicine, now that's all they're doing, and they're quite comfortable with it. And I think that it can really help propel, engage people more and give them more confidence that somebody is really caring about their health and safety. And that's really, at the end of the day, what I think it's all about.
Yeah, I think that's so great. I love that, Joel. I would just say, what it does is it gives opportunities for both drug developers and for patients to meet in new ways, and it kind of expands the patient population for drug developers, and that offers them a greater opportunity to improve people's health.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I really want to thank our panelists. You guys have been great. This conversation has been super educational for me, and I hope that you in the audience have also enjoyed. Thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties, and thank you for spending an hour of your time to learn a little bit more about the future of clinical trials using telemedicine. Any closing thoughts that you feel we didn't touch on that you think are really vital to the conversation? We covered it. Good. No, just
no, I
straight
think
up
we
no.
did.
I like it. I like it.
We did really well. I think we covered a lot in a short period of time.
Yeah.
We did. It was pretty dense. A lot to listen to.
Yeah. Thanks, Julie.
And there are, just to let you know, our panelists cannot see when you, our audience, are sending in questions. There have been a couple of questions. Someone very graciously found the article that we were talking about and posted it. So thank you. And there's some thanks coming in from the audience as well. So thanks, everyone. And we will be back next week talking about how biotech can solve One Health issues. So a little bit of a switch from today's conversation, but no doubt will be also just as engaging. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.